The 13th tribe, the Khazar Empire and its heritage. Some Persian and Arab chronicles provide an attractive combination of legend and gossip column. They may start with the creation and end with stop-press tidbits. Thus, Yaqubi, a 9th century Arab historian, traces the origins of the Khazars back to Japheth, third son of Noah. The Japheth motive recurs frequently in the literature, while other legends connect them with Abraham or Alexander the Great. One of the earliest factual references to the Khazars occurs in a Syriac chronicle by Zanchara Raktor, dating from the middle of the 6th century. It mentions the Khazars in a list of people who inhabit the region of the Caucasus. Other sources indicate that they were already much in evidence a century earlier and intimately connected with the Huns. In AD 448, the Byzantine Emperor Theodorus II sent an embassy to Attila, which included a famed rhetorician by the name of Priscus. He kept a minute account not only of the diplomatic negotiations, but also of the court intrigues and goings-on in Attila's sumptuous banqueting hall. He was, in fact, the perfect gossip columnist, and is still one of the main sources of information about Han customs and habits. But Priscus also has anecdotes to tell about a people subject to the Huns, whom he calls Ak-Khazars, that is very likely the Ak-Khazars or White Khazars, as distinct from the Black Kara Khazars. The Byzantine Emperor Priscus tells us tried to win this warrior race over to his side, but the greedy Khazar chieftain named Karadach considered the bribe offered to him inadequate and sided with the Huns. Attila defeated Karadach's rival chieftains, installed him as the sole ruler of the Ak-Khazars, and invited him to visit his courts. Karadach thanked him profusely for the invitation, and went on to say that it would be too hard on a mortal man to look into the face of a god, for as one cannot stare into the sun's disk, even less could one look into the face of the greatest god without suffering injury. Attila must have been pleased, for he confirmed Karadach in his rule. Priscus' chronicle confirms that the Khazars appeared on the European scene about the middle of the 5th century as a people under Hunnish sovereignty, and may be regarded, together with the Magyars and other tribes, as a later offspring of Attila's horde. The collapse of the Hun Empire after Attila's death left a power vacuum in Eastern Europe, through which once more wave after wave of nomadic hordes swept from east to west. Prominent among them the Uyghurs and Avars. The Khazars during most of this period seem to be happily occupied with raiding the rich trans-Caucasian regions of Georgia and Armenia, and collecting precious plunder. During the second half of the 6th century, they became the dominant force among the tribes north of the Caucasus. A number of these tribes, the Sabirs, Saragurs, Samandars, Balangars, etc., are from this date onwards no longer mentioned by name in the sources. They have been subdued or absorbed by the Khazars. The toughest resistance, apparently, was offered by the powerful Bulgars, but they too were crushingly defeated around 641, and as a result, the nation split into two. Some of them migrated westward to the Danube, into the region of modern Bulgaria. Others northeastward to the Middle Volga, the later remaining under Khazar suzerainty. We shall frequently encounter both Danube Bulgars and Volga Bulgars in the course of this narrative. But before becoming a sovereign state, the Khazars still had to serve their apprenticeship under another short-lived power. The so-called West Turkish Empire, or Turkut Kingdom. It was a confederation of tribes held together by a ruler, the Kagan, or Kagan, a title which the Khazar rulers too were subsequently to adapt. This first Turkish state, if one may call it that, lasted for a century, 550 to 650, and then fell apart, leaving hardly any trace. However, it was only after the establishment of this kingdom that the name Turk was used to apply to a specific nation, as distinct from other Turkish-speaking peoples like the Khazars and Bulgars. The Khazars had been under Han tutelage, then under Turkish tutelage. After the eclipse of the Turks in the middle of the 7th century, it was their turn to rule the Kingdom of the North, as the Persians and Byzantines came to call it. According to one tradition, the great Persian king Khosrow and Nushirwan the Blessed had 3 golden guest thrones in his palace, reserved for the emperors of Byzantium, China, and of the Khazars. No state visits from these potentates materialized, and the golden thrones, if they existed, must have served a purely symbolic purpose. But whatever fact or legend, the story fits in well with Emperor Constantine's official account of the triple gold seal assigned by the imperial chancery to the ruler of the Khazars. Thus, during the first few decades of the 7th century, just before the Muslim hurricane was unleashed from Arabia, the Middle East was dominated by a triangle of powers: Byzantium, Persia, and the West Turkish Empire. The first 2 of these had been waging intermittent war against each other for a century, and both seemed on the verge of collapse. In the sequel, Byzantium recovered, but the Persian kingdom was soon to meet its doom, and the Khazars were actually in on the kill. They were still nominally under the suzerainty of the West Turkish kingdom, within which they represented the strongest effective force, and to which they were soon to succeed. Accordingly, in 627, the Roman Emperor Horatius concluded a military alliance with the Khazars, the first of several to follow. in preparing his decisive campaign against Persia. There are several versions of the role played by the Khazars in that campaign, which seems to have been somewhat inglorious, but the principal facts are well established. The Khazars provided Horatius with 40,000 horsemen under a chieftain named Cybele, who participated in the advance into Persia, but then, presumably fed up with the cautious strategy of the Greeks, turned back to lay siege on Tiflis. This was unsuccessful, but the next year they again joined forces with Horatius, took the Georgian capital, and returned with rich plunder. Gibbon has given a colorful description based on Theophanes of the first meeting between the Roman emperor and the Khazar chieftain. To the hostile league of Chosroes with the Avars, the Roman emperor opposed the useful and honorable alliance with the Turks. To the hostile league of Chosroes with the Avars, the Roman emperor opposed the useful and honorable alliance of the Turks. At his liberal invitation, the horde of Khazars transported their tents from the plains of the Volga to the mountains of Georgia. Heraclius received them in the neighborhood of Tiflis, and the Khan, with his nobles, dismounted from their horses, if we may credit the Greeks, and fell prostrate on the ground to adore the purple of the Caesar. Such voluntary homage and important aid were entitled to the warmest acknowledgments, and the emperor, taking off his own diadem, placed it on the head of the Turkish prince, whom he saluted with a tender embrace and the appellation of son. After a sumptuous banquet, he presented Cybele with the plate and ornaments, the gold, the gems, and the silk, which had been used at the imperial table, and with his own hand distributed rich jewels and earnings to his new allies. In a secret interview, he produced the portrait of his daughter, Eudocia, condescended to flatter the barbarian with the promise of a fair and august bride, and obtained an immediate secure of 40,000 horse. Eudocia, or Epiphania, was the only daughter of Heraclius by his first wife. The promise to give her in marriage to the Turk indicates once more the high value set by the Byzantine court on the Khazar alliance. However, the marriage came to naught because Cybele died while Eudocia and her suite were on their way to him. There is also an ambivalent reference in Theophanes to the effect that Cybele presented his son, a beardless boy, to the emperor as a quid pro quo. There is another Pitrique passage in an Armenian chronicle quoting the text of what might be called an order of mobilization issued by the Khazar ruler for the second campaign against Persia. It was addressed to all tribes and people under Khazar authority, inhabitants of the mountains and the plains, living under roofs or the open sky, having their heads shaved or wearing their hair long. This gives us a first intimation of the heterogeneous ethnic mosaic that was to compose the Khazar Empire. The real Khazars who ruled it were probably always a minority, as the Austrians were in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy.